In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the rise of early monasticism in the church, both in the east and in the western halves of the late Roman Empire. And the reason we study monasticism has really a couple of features within it. The popular misconception of monasticism usually arises after or as a result of the Reformation. If you look at the ways in which the monastic movement suffered after the Reformation, and some of the things that were said about monastics by Luther and Calvin and others in England, in all the areas and countries in the 16th century that were touched by Protestantism, you tend to get a bit of a strange image of monasticism that is a bit out of joint with the way monasticism functioned historically. There are a lot of popular misconceptions about monasticism. Some of them have kernels of truth, others of them do not. And so we should start just briefly by defining what a monk or what a monastic house is. The first thing we have to discuss is that monastic people were not the kinds of people that we find in the later Middle Ages. They were not living in monasteries necessarily to save their own souls. They were not enacting lives of penance, at least not to the extent that we find Luther and others doing in the 15th and 16th centuries. Monasticism has an important role to play in the development of the church, both in the East and in the West. And it should be noted historically that despite the fact that monasticism later took on so many changes and it became so enmeshed in late medieval Catholicism that it led Protestants to ultimately reject the monastic movement, nevertheless, there were elements of the monastic movement that we have to both acknowledge as being pivotal and important, and in some cases, which we can cherish as part of the wider heritage of the Western Church and of the Church as a whole throughout the world. First of all, we should look at a definition. What is a monk? The origins of a monk come from the early church, but they don't really begin there. The early church took concepts of ascetical life and they adapted them to meet the Christian world of the first 3 or 4 centuries of the church. If we look in the Old Testament, we see examples of self-denial, prophets or leaders who are called by God who abstain from things, sometimes for a period of time, and sometimes for longer. We know, for example, the Nazirite vow, the vow that Samson and others took, a vow to never touch a fermented drink, to not touch alcohol, not to cut your hair. We also see the prophets at times, particularly Elijah, living seemingly alone in the desert, praying to God, interceding for people for God, living a life devoted directly to God apart from the world. And there were lots of Jewish traditions of ascetical life. We can't explore all of those, but we can at least acknowledge that there is a Jewish background to ascetical life. We see in the New Testament 2 examples of ascetical life that are commendable in some ways, or at least they can be mimicked in this life. The first is St. John the Baptist, moving out into the wilderness, wearing a hair shirt, eating locusts and honey, and preaching the kingdom of God. John the Baptist, in fact, is one of the main inspirations for the monastic order. There are all kinds of parallels to what monks are attempting to do in the wilderness and what John the Baptist is attempting to do as the forerunner to Messiah. Above all, though, you see Christ himself going through periods of fasting, 40 days in the wilderness, these sorts of things. We also have Jesus' teachings that are very clear, in one case, that we should sell all of our possessions and follow God. In the early church, though, this backdrop starts to take on a new seriousness with the rise of monasticism. Now, let's begin first by talking about what a monk is. If you just look at the Greek origin of the word, a monk is someone who lives alone. The Greek word monos is the word for alone. Therefore, a monk is someone who is ideally living in some way alone and isolated from the world around them. The word monk can be applied in a couple of different ways, and we're going to talk about both of them in this lecture. The first form of monasticism is what we call eremitical monasticism. It is hermit. If you look at the word eremitical and you just sort of add an H to the front of it, you can kind of get the sense, heremetical, a hermit. A hermit, as we even use that word today, would be someone who lives alone, someone who lives almost entirely in isolation. And the eremitical monastics were people who often attempted to live in the desert, usually in caves, sometimes in fortresses, abandoned buildings, these kinds of things. Or they lived on the edges of deserts so that they could withdraw for periods of time into the wilderness. So when we look at the origins of the eremitical side, there is really one great forefather or founder of the eremitical tradition, and that is St. Anthony. St. Anthony was a Greek-speaking Christian living in and around the area of Alexandria in the middle to late 3rd century, and on in really to the middle of the 4th century, who decided to perfect his calling by following the example of John the Baptist and Jesus. Now, most of what we know about St. Anthony was not written down by him, but rather was written in a biography by the great Athanasius, the scourge of Arians and the defender of the incarnation of Christ. And Athanasius, for a time, had met with and explored the life of monasticism and seemed to have been enamored by it. And it led to him writing a great biography of St. Anthony. And Anthony, Athanasius tells us, was somebody who decided that he had had enough with society, that he was concerned about pursuing Christ to the fullest, that he wanted to live a life devoted fully to God and to not be wrapped up in the everyday cares of life. And so, Athanasius tells us, Anthony moved to the edge of a desert. The desert was just a number of miles west of Alexandria, and Athanasius tells us that Anthony lived in this desert for about 13 years. Now, the common question that comes up at this point is, well, what did he eat? How did he live? If he's in an actual desert, where's the water? And the short answer is he survived on very, very little. He didn't eat very much. In fact, he was almost always fasting. The little that he did eat was often brought to him by pilgrims or by lay people who would come out to the desert to consult with St. Anthony as a wise man. They would bring him maybe a piece of bread, or they'd bring him some other sorts of things, and he would often sort of sit there and dispense wisdom as they came to him with their cares. And these 13 years were formative for St. Anthony. Tradition has it, mostly through Athanasius, we know that these 13 years were a period of some sort of trial or torment. There are all these stories of the devil tormenting Anthony directly. He sent phantoms of women designed to seduce him. He sent him beasts designed to scare him. And at the end of the 13 years, we are told, the devil actually physically beat St. Anthony to a pulp, nearly beats him to death. He only comes to at some point, and he decides that he has to withdraw from the desert for a period of time for convalescence. And this ongoing tradition of St. Anthony tempted and tormented by the devil is really symbolized by Michelangelo's famous painting of the torment of St. Anthony. You see that the demonic spirit sort of wrapped around him, attacking him and assaulting him. Yet he withstood, even after being physically harmed. He takes on his second monastic period of trial. In this case, St. Anthony moved to an old Roman fort. There were all of these now abandoned forts on the edges of the Roman Empire. Remember, these are the times of the civil wars. This is just on the cusp of Constantine's rise to the throne. But nonetheless, in this case, there was an old Roman fort that had been abandoned, and St. Anthony decides to move into it. Now, there is no comfort in this fort. It's a shell of a building, really. But it provides him some sort of boundaries. And we are told that St. Anthony locked the door, he barred the door, he did something that would enclose him in this cell or in this sort of small fort. And there Anthony lived for an additional 20 years. And much that we have of Anthony's sayings, of his wisdom, comes from this period of time. When pilgrims would come to the fort, they'd bring a little bit of food. As they would pass the food, usually through a little window, he would stand there as they asked their questions, and the response would sort of be whispered back through the door. And for the next 20 years, St. Anthony is locked in this fort, and he is engaging in ascetical practices of denying oneself, of prayer. Again, there are struggles with the devil. And in this case, we are told he overcomes. He overcomes not by his own power, but he overcomes, we are told, because when he is tempted and when he sees these demonic forces come at him, he responds by saying that they have no power over him, that he belongs to Christ, and that therefore he is not afraid. And the story goes that St. Anthony was then granted God's favor and the devil was forced to flee. So that's St. Anthony. Anthony is, again, a bit of a warrior. In fact, Anthony is historically considered one of the great athletes of God, and that's actually a technical term. Following Anthony and following the description of his heroic exploration of the Christian life, often these early eremitical monastics would be called the athletes of God, using the Pauline language of sanctification as something like exercise, where you beat your body into submission. The couch potato in us all has to be forced to submit. When the eremitical monastics consider what they are attempting to do, they see themselves as engaging in the Christian life through a series of seemingly athletic exercises. Again, it's a parallel. They're not actually doing athletics. If you're not eating all day long, the desire to do exercises probably wouldn't be very strong. But nonetheless, the spiritual exercises, the labor of spiritual formation, is something that the early eremitical monastics consider to be very, very important. And it raises just one minor point that is worth noting, and that is the early monastics, and historically the background in the Old Testament and New Testament, saw monasticism in a particular light. And this is something that was essentially lost over a period of time or forgotten. And that is when a monastic decides that he is going to renounce marriage, or he is going to renounce property, or that he is going to fast and go through a life of abstinence or even a period of abstinence, you have to remember that in these early centuries of the church, it was still allowed for priests to marry. It was still allowed in nearly every case for a priest to own property. Fasting was, of course, a responsibility of all Christians for certain periods of time. Voluntary fasting, in some cases communal fasting, where a church would decide that they were going to fast for perhaps a big decision or for any number of reasons. And that drives home the point that when a monastic person in the early church is seeking to abstain from certain things, the early impulse was not to see these things as inherently evil. So marriage, for example, is never maligned as some sort of fault of the person who has to get married for his own lusts. Property is not considered evil on its own. Fasting is not undertaken because food is somehow evil. So we have to remember that in these early days, this is a process of, in general, sanctification is what they're seeking. The Christian life lived out before God. And what they are doing, what these monks are doing, people like St. Anthony, is they are abstaining from the things that the average person, even the average pastor or priest, took part in, not because they were evil, but because it was an additional sacrifice. Just again, as the Nazarenes or John the Baptist didn't believe that fermented drink or that living in the cities was inherently evil, nevertheless, they abstained from certain things to live devoted to God. And that really is why we talk about the early athletes of God, these early monks. If eremitical monasticism or hermit-style monasticism was the first type of monasticism to come on the scene, the second type of monasticism is what we know today as Cenobite or Cenobitic monasticism. This word is a bit strange, at least in terms of its etymology. It comes from two Greek words that are combined and then kind of morphed over time. And the two words are koinos and bios. The idea here is that a Cenobite lives in a common life. A koinos bios, a common life. In other words, Cenobitic or Cenobite monasticism is the kind of monasticism that we know very well in the Western Church, where monks live together as a community. They share a common life together. They do certain things together. They, of course, have periods where they withdraw maybe for personal prayer, but the goal of a Cenobite is not to live in isolation, but to live in a community of monks separated from the world, but nevertheless working together for their own Christian lives, for their own sanctification and other things. Cenobite monasticism is begun about the same time, just slightly after the time of St. Anthony. And the first to come on the scene with this idea is St. Pachomius. Pachomius has much of the same impulse that Anthony does. He desires to be a Christian athlete, to use that term again. He wants to live a life fully devoted to God. He wants to sell all that he has and devote himself to a life of prayer. He is born in the city of Thebes, which is the modern day of Luxor, Egypt. He is actually a soldier. Pachomius actually served during the Roman civil wars, the crisis of the late 3rd century, as we call it. He was your average Roman pagan soldier. His parents were pagan. He had no contact with the Christian world. Pachomius eventually finds himself essentially suppressed or oppressed both physically and militarily. He ends up landing in a city in Egypt, and while he is there, he and a number of other young soldiers are kind of hard-pressed. And what happens is, in the city, the Christian community begins to take care of these soldiers. They come out each day and they give them food and comfort. They are amazing examples of Christian hospitality. And Pachomius, again, just a pagan, part of the Roman establishment as an army soldier, he vows then and there that when his army service is over, he is going to explore Christianity. He wants to see what these Christians are all about. If this is the model that they're going to live by, he was actually intrigued by it. And so in 314, Pachomius is baptized. And early on, Pachomius models his desire to be a monk off of St. Anthony directly. In fact, his first attempt is to move near St. Anthony in the region of Alexandria. As we are told, though, a voice comes to Pachomius and it tells him that he should not live in isolation in full, but that he should actually build a residence for a number of monastic individuals who live around the area. And this gave rise to Pachomius building what we call the Tabina Monastery. It was built and sort of developed sometime around 318 to 323. And the Tabina Monastery is a bit of an interesting amalgam or a development, really, of the monastic way of life. The Tabina Monastery focuses on monks living in what we would today call cells, cell clusters. What the ideal here is that monks would live in moderate community. They live in somewhat in a communal lifestyle, but that they would, again, withdraw for a period of time for themselves. And first his brother, and then eventually up to about 100 monks come and live at the Tabina Monastery. Most live in huts or they live in caves around the Tabina Monastery, and these men and women would come together out of their huts and caves for periods of worship. They held all things in common at the Tabina Monastery. Lots of the things that we would come to know as Cenobite monasticism or monastic houses are all designed here at Tabina. And one of the final things that Pachomius gives us is the name of the abbot. While at the Tabina Monastery, the monks would call him Abba, which of course means father. They would call him Abba Pachomius, Father Pachomius. And over time, the word Abba became associated with the head of a Cenobite monastic order. And therefore, over time, the Abba becomes the abbot or the abbess, the man or the woman who is in charge of a Cenobite monastic community. And all of the rules and all of the practices that St. Pachomius draws up are eventually written down in what we call the Ascetica. The Ascetica is really a sort of a textbook or a rule book for how to live in a monastic house with multiple entities. How do you live together? How do you share all things in common? How do you conduct work? And so forth. And the Ascetica really, particularly in the East, it's largely forgotten in the West, but the Ascetica in the East has become the benchmark or the early foundational lodestone of the Cenobite monastic orders, particularly in the East. For Western monasticism, there was one great monastic founder of the Cenobite movement, and that was Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict was an Italian. He was born in the area of Nursia. He spent his early years studying in Rome, and after a period of study, he decided to retreat to Campania. Now, the impulse for Benedict to live a monastic life was already there. In Campania, he meets up with some other individuals living the monastic life, but Benedict's zeal for monastic practice actually seemed to have offended these monks, and they actually attempt to poison him to death, forcing him to flee. Benedict then flees to Monte Cassino, which is the place where his name would finally be established as one of the great founders of monasticism. Most of what we know about Benedict comes from a later writing by Pope Gregory the Great. Gregory and his dialogues, which are a resource that historians have explored for centuries to understand the period of time as well as to understand Gregory's theology. The dialogues have a number of accounts of Benedict and Benedict's zeal for monastic life and for the ways in which Benedict ordered the house in Monte Cassino to live to a certain rigorous piety. And what Gregory notes for us is that Benedict doesn't retreat for his own sake. He doesn't retreat for the sake of his own sanctification, his own self-denial, his own desire to live before God. But we are told that Benedict desires to save the world, the monastic house, the work of monks, as somehow contributing to the kingdom at large. And this really is a bit of a departure. As we'll see in later lectures, Western monasticism begins to take on this tone as those who are there to not remove themselves from society, but remove themselves in general and then serve society, whether it's through medicine, whether it's through prayer, preaching, teaching, whether it's through food and clothing to the poor, whatever it might be. In the West, following Gregory's sort of impulse, the Western monastic world will see itself as saving the world, as saving those around them. And while at Monte Cassino, Benedict comes up with not just a generic understanding of monasticism, of living in community, but Benedict actually writes what we call a rule, that is, a regula. In fact, later Western monks are sometimes called the regular clergy. It doesn't mean that the others are not regular or that they're somehow strange. Rather, the regula, the regular clergy, are the clergy or the monks who follow a rule. And the rule of St. Benedict, it cannot be overemphasized, the effect the rule will have on Western monasticism. The book is in 73 chapters. It has a prologue. It then has 7 chapters on what we might call the philosophy of the ascetical life. And the rest of the book deals with practical matters. It deals with what the character of a monk ought to be. It deals with very sort of earthy things like sleeping arrangements, manual labor. It stressed that monks should not eat meat and that they should only have limited wine. It demanded that there be no property for the monks, that they leave their material possessions behind. And the brilliance of the Benedictine rule is not so much that it was overly ornate, but actually that it was so flexible. The rule, in fact, can be applied to any number of different contexts. When it talks about manual labor, it doesn't specify what it has to be. It just says manual labor needs to be part of life. When it talks about the other practices of the day and of life, it allows for enormous flexibility to occur. And in fact, the rule becomes so important in Western history, due in large part to its flexibility. Just a couple of things about what life would be like in the Benedictine house. The praying of the canonical hours, or what's sometimes called the daily office. This is one of the things that Benedict does put in stone that becomes really the hallmark of not just Catholic Western Christianity, but it has been carried over into a number of even Protestant traditions. And this is the idea that there ought to be regular prayer hours throughout the day for a Christian. And prayer began with matins. Matins began in the middle of the night. It was between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m. when the monks would rise and come together and they would pray. And after a period of prayers, usually not overly long, maybe somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, prayer would be said and then they would go back to bed. That would then be followed up by lauds, which was the prayer at first light. Then there would be prime, Prime was the mid-morning prayer, usually around 9 a.m., and that would be followed up by the lunch prayer time of terce, sometimes called sext, sometimes called nones. And that was the lunch prayer. This would be followed up by vespers, which would be the prayers at dusk. Then there would be compline. Compline would be the prayer to end the day of work. And finally, at long last, you would get to nocturne, which would be the prayers said just before bed. And these prayers have gone through a number of different practices. Some monastic houses kept slightly different variations of this. Some monastic houses got in the habit of all-night vigils on occasion. But nonetheless, the supreme desire of the monk ought to be that of prayer. And in fact, not just a little bit of prayer, but a great deal of prayer. And so when we look at the rise and the development of early monasticism, we see two different impulses. We see two different trajectories, really. On the one hand, you have the eremitical tradition, which starts on relatively solid footing. It is not a Gnostic movement that is denying life and marriage and food because it sees the world as evil. Rather, it is attempting to apply the biblical pattern of an additional vow on top of what was required or expected of Christians. Very often, both in the East and in the West, it was the Cenobite monastic houses, the communal monastic houses that would come to dominate the world. In the East, the Cenobite monastic houses have carried on all the way down till today. They have as well in the West, but what happened in the Western Church, of course, is with Protestantism and with a number of developments in the Middle Ages, you see a number of changes that happen in monasticism that give rise to a variety of problems. In the West, in particular, you have the problem over the course of the Middle Ages of the monastic houses becoming lazy. There is some archaeological evidence that monastic houses, in some cases, once they became endowed with money and property and farms, actually ate quite well. They weren't always living the life of ascetical piety, that at times they were quite well-fed and well-watered. And as we'll see in a later lecture, as some monastic houses become more lazy or they become corrupted, you have the rise of reform efforts within the church to reestablish committed Orthodox monastic houses. And some of those inspirations, some of those attempts at reform directly relate to ongoing developments that go all the way down to Protestantism and actually lead to a number of developments in theology and in Christian thinking.